Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog Solo. And in this series, I'm getting the terms right, and we're focusing on imperialism. We come to finance capital. Now, I did a speed run through the 19th and very early 20th century concepts of imperialism, ending at Lenin's. And there's no way that Lenin's concept of imperialism is not going to get its own show. In fact, so is Bukharin's. Um, and then we have to deal with the middle and late 20th century too. But outside of John Hobson's first book on imperialism, which was a underconsumptionist liberal view that saw imperialism as a deviation that was separate from capitalism and that better banking policy could get away from it, we start seeing Marxists deal with it more explicitly than in Marx. And remember, in Marx, imperialism doesn't mean what we mean by it. In fact, if you have a theory of imperialism, it's in a primitive accumulation, so called, and not in what Marx called imperialism, which was more just a description of the Bonapartist state in France and in liberalism in crisis, which was consistent with the way that term was used in the middle of the 19th century. But for us, we need to look at finance capital. Now, finance capital is one of those concepts that really shifts depending on who you're talking to. If you're talking to a Wall Street banker or a modern economist, it means one thing. If you're talking to a modern Marxist historian, it means a couple of different other things. At its core, it describes the melding of banking and industry. But the implications of the melding of banking and industry are highly debated, and they're highly debated both in the history of Marxism and in general economics as a whole. So, the classical definition of finance capital, which was developed actually by Rudolph Hilferding, partly in response to people like Werner Sombart, who were talking about late capitalism in like 1905. By the way, that concept is very old. It's like over 100 years old. Ernst Mandel did not invent it. In 1910, Rudolph Hilferding wrote Finance Capital. He argued that as capitalism matures, banks stop being a middleman function of capital and start becoming masters of industry. The key concept, to quote him in translation, an ever increasing proportion of capital is used in industry is finance capital. Capital is at the disposal of banks, which is then used by industrialists or other rentiers, actually, and we'll get to that. The key feature of this is it paralleled monopolization and led to a centralization of power where a few massive banks control large shares of the industrial corporations through credit and stock ownership. This actually solved two problems in Marxist theory going all the way back to Marx and Engels, but we'll come back to that. We're going to spend a good portion of this video talking about Hilferding, but right now we're going to cover the other definitions. Then this particular definition was expanded by Lenin, who took Hilferding's work and removed its theoretical framework, but applied it, mixed it with Bukharin's work on imperialism. To finance capital. For Lenin, finance capital was part of the highest stage of capitalism. Once a few banks control the nation's industry, they run out of profitable places to invest at home and have to invest elsewhere, both expanding markets and getting raw accumulation. Thus, there's a fusion of banking and industrial capital, which was exacerbated by both the monopolization of large banks over finance and the monopolization of large industry in prior competitive fields. The consequences necessitates the export of capital to other countries, which was beyond just the export of goods. It also exported debt relations. This leads to a drive for new markets and resources, which leads to A, just classical colonialism, and B, when that fails, conflict in the global market and the possibilities of increasing proxy and direct wars. In short, you have both colonialism and expropriation through other means of leverage. Lenin spells this out in his Imperialism pamphlet, where he combines Hobson, Hilferding, and Bukharin into a geopolitical theory. Now, I'm going to say that probably over and over in this series on imperialism because I think it's often missed. Hilferding was also influential on the theory of superimperialism by Karl Kautsky, but we'll come back to that later on in this video. Now, when we talk about finance capital today, we often talk about it in terms of either modern economic perspectives of financialization. So what do we mean by finance capital now? We do not mean the banks control factories through their credit usage. We mean financialization of the markets as a whole, which means the increasing role of financial motives, financial markets, financial actors, and financial institutions in the operation of domestic and international economies through both joint stock ownership, so stock manipulation, and credit. It's no longer just about banks, though. It's about shareholder value and shareholder control. Managers are prioritized for short-term shock prices over long-term industrial health because the fiduciary responsibility that they have to stockholders who are the generators of credit. We can see this financialization as the expansion and structuralization of capital in the cartel state. So the key indicator is a larger share of GDP is non-productive. It comes from the financial sector, including banking, insurance, and real estate, compared to the manufacturing sector. And figuring out what part of the financial sector is actually leading to more production in the economy is very hard to do. So Rudolph Hilferding's finance capital is the most influential expansion of Marxist economics theory in a lot of ways. I mean, the other ones that are super important are like Henrik Grossman's theories about the declining rates of profit, etc., because it affects not just the way we talk about this in Marxist history, it affects like very real parts of the economy and is mappable. So then there's a fourth definition you might deal with when you talk about finance capital, which is a functionalist definition. And strictly the technical sense that you use in business school, finance capital is just liquid assets used by a firm to fund its operations. It can be both equity capital, which is selling shares, or debt capital, which is loans and bonds. Now, it's important to note that Marx would have seen these as fictitious capital, which is something that Marx says is wealth that only exists on paper, like stocks and derivatives, that isn't directly tied to tangible machinery or physical commodities, but represents a claim on future profits, which may or may not exist because we don't know if the valuation today is valorizable. That means we don't know if when you go to sell these claims on future profits, that those profits will actually come in, or that they are sellable at the price currently evaluated at. This is really important for understanding financialization, but it's also what finance capital means when you go to business school. All right. Now, before we get into a deep dive into Hilferding, I want to talk about when we deal with finance capital today, because it comes up a lot. One, you have the rise of shareholder primacy. Before the 1980s, corporations generally followed a retain and invest model. Profits were kept to buy new machinery or to hire workers. But as finance capital expanded, this shifted to downsize and distribute. Now, what this means is the primary goal of CGO shifted from the health of the firm to the maximization and of shareholder value. You have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders that does not decrease, which means short-term profits are always prioritized. This also leads to kind of stock manipulation through investing in research instead of investing in research and development a lot of the time, although we have seen some of that pick up. Companies began using profits to buy back their own shares, thus artificially inflating stock prices to satisfy investors. Now, this often actually cannibalizes the company, but that's not the point. To align with interest, executive compensation became increasingly tied to stock performance and stock ownership, incentivizing the short-term price hikes over long-term stability, even in management, because management was paid partially, although and probably more of their actual income in stock. Two, while Hilferding really saw the banks and industry merging, modern financialization has seen them drift apart in some kind of key ways. One, internal banking. Large industrial firms like GE and Ford started acting like banks themselves. And at this point, GE Capital provides more of General Electric's profit than the actual appliances or engineers. The profit rates come effectively from rents, which is when we get to decline of rated profit debates in the series, which I'm eventually going to cover after I cover Maoism and Third Worldism and revisit Trotskyism in a more systematic way. I am going to cover the fall of the rated profits debate. One of the ways it distorts the fall of the rated profits debate is how IP holding and rents through things like GE Capital distort profits in a way that makes it seem like they're super leveraged. And it means that Marxists and general economists aren't talking about the same thing. And even some Marxists don't get that. But anyway. So this leads to profit without production or revenue without production. A larger portion of total corporate profits now come from financial activities, lending, trading, and hedging, rather than selling products. This does not seem sustainable. And we've only done it for a generation. So people say, oh, we've always done it that way. We've always had finance capital. Finance capital, in some ways, is older as a way of funding things than even capitalism. All right. So this leads to a couple of shifts. In the traditional economy, you have an MCM circuit. With the MCM prime circuit, you can go look through Capital Volume 1 to see this. You start with money, you produce a commodity, and you sell it for more money. In the last 40 years, we've seen the rise of an M cycle where the commodity, the actual work product, is bypassed entirely or is used indirectly. So money is made through derivatives and speculation and securitization. And some people see this as purely parasitic. One of the problems, though, is it is still true that non-productive economies cannot do this effectively. Even the UK, which I often chastise for not being super productive, is still technically a productive economy. It does produce things, just not at a scale that would supply like a very generous social safety net or something, if you were basing this off of profit returns. So, financialization also accelerates a kind of different stage of imperialism. Financialization isn't just a Western phenomenon, it's also defined as the export of capital as Lenin described it. And this can be seen in modern financialization. One, it leads to debt traps. Most developing nations become integrated into the global economy, not through trade, because frankly, they don't have the material production capacity to utilize all their assets. They're often very rich in raw materials, but it's not utilizable without access to other fixed capital, aka machines, which some of them develop on their own, and also trade leverage, which they are legally kept out of. So this leads them to have massive debt obligations to international private banks in order to get started, which eats up most of their profits back into the banking system of the developing world. This is what I actually see as the rational core of third worldism. Capital flight also becomes even more of a problem because money can move around borders instantly. If a country tries to raise taxes and regulations, finance capital flees immediately to a more deregulated environment. See the Panama Papers? Giving finance markets a veto power over national politics unless you have major capital controls. And you can only have so many capital controls and get international investment. This leads to a K-shaped reality on the planet. Now, we're experiencing internally to the US today in 2026, but this was kind of everywhere. This trend leads to a divergence where the stock market can be booming while wages and infrastructure remain stagnant, and even traditional commodity profits go down. Finance capital today is more mobile, digital, and often detached from the physical reality of the workers who sustain it, but it's still dependent on that as the means of getting things into the system. After all, if no one's the only reason people are buying stocks and loaning in the first place is to make money, but they're making money by actually consuming and using the consumptive goods. This is distorting, and who knows how long it can distort, but it is a major problem. Okay. Now we can look at some case studies about financialization and the problems of it. In 2008, the DIAS was a perfect storm for financialization. It demonstrated what happens when the financial sector becomes so detached from underlying asset value that it created a global catastrophe. Now, people might think today's AI stuff is like this, but it's really not, for reasons that are more complicated in this video. But if you think about the mechanism, which is securitization, banks took thousands of individual mortgages and burned them back into mortgage-backed security, and then sold these sliced into tranches and sold them to global investors. This has been explained multiple times now for 20 years. Derivatives, which were basically proof of the concept of fictitious capital, were created on the bet that on whether these bundles would fail. Eventually, the value of the bets far exceeded the value of the actual houses because of subprime lending. When homeowners could not pay the inflated houses, the house of cards collapsed, and financial capital was interconnected globally, causing most of it, outside of China anyway, to respond. It proved that finance wasn't just a layer on top of the economy, but actually was part of the infrastructure itself. There's another case study. We can look at private equity, which is the vulture theory of capital. If Hilferding saw banks as helping industry, even though increasingly monopolizing them, private equity is strip mining them. Now, private equity is different from public equity because firms like Blackstone and KKR embody the downsize and distribute model to the point that a lot of the businesses they buy fail. The strategy of leveraged buyouts allows the company to move small amounts of money around and leads to a massive amount of borrowed money. The debt is placed in the books of the company being bought, not the private equity firm. And this leads to an extraction, paying off the new debt and generating profits. The company is forced to reduce staff, sell off real estate, which is probably the biggest way, and underinvest in long-term maintenance, often causing the companies to fail, but leading high profits for the private equity firm. This is a literal parasitic form of capital. And then there is the Wall Streetization of everything. While everything feels like a casino now, we might call it the casinoization too. Financialization has moved in the areas previously considered non-financial. Some theorists call this financialization of social reproduction itself. So you have student debt. Education is not a public good. It is a $1 trillion debt market. And I'm going to do a whole video on that soon. And housing is increasingly tied into global investors. Now, not private equity investors, actually. They're a very small percentage of people who own housing. You don't need that for that to be destructive. All right. Now, one of the central questions that have always come up in the way we've handled this, and this came up in debates around the Comintern too, was if finance capital is going to cause either a slow evolution into socialism or a financial collapse of capitalism, or if it would find a way to stabilize itself. Now, Hilferding had a lot of influence on the Comintern because of his influence and debates with Nikolai Bukharin and Vladimir Lenin. In the mid-20s, Bukharin suggested that capitalism had entered a new phase. Drawing on Hilferding and on his own prior work, actually in the 1910s, when he did his own theory of imperialism, which also drew on Hilferding. But Bukharin argued that the fusion of the banks and industry allowed the state to organize the economy. This suppressed competition and prevented the chaotic anarchy of the market that usually led to crises. So it led to a more stable economy, although financialization is clearly not doing that now. But that's what he was talking about in the 1920s in his theory of monopoly capital, which is separate from the theory that was come up by Baran and Sweezy in the mid-century. We'll come back to that another day. Those debates are fun. This had political implications that if capitalism is becoming more organized and stable, the revolution was not immediate due to immiseration. This was also what he used to justify the NEP, and that's going to get him into some headway later because it doesn't make sense with his theory of imperialism, kind of. And also led him to encourage a united front strategy in the West, where communists would work with more moderate socialists without joining governance with them. This was actually something that Bukharin had opposed from Trotsky, and when Trotsky came up with it, based off of his reading of the Amsterdam Congress in 1905, but nonetheless, it was adopted from 1921 forward. Now, there's a radical turn in the third period where Stalin and Molotov start thinking that organized capitalism is not going to work, that there is no way that this is going to be successful. They claimed that they had entered a third period, which would be a terminal final crisis of capitalism, much vaunted final crisis that everybody seems to believe in. We'll get to that when we come to Grossman later on. They argued that finance capital was no longer a stabilizing force, but a parasitic one. And that the social fascists believed that since capitalism was collapsing, social democrats were actually social fascists because they were helping to prop up a dying system like the fascists were. That was the thought of the third period. As the 1930s progressed and the Great Depression hit, the debate turned to the relationship between finance capital and fascism, which actually led to a new development at the Seventh World Congress of the Comintern. Georgy Dimitrov delivered a definitive Comintern view that fascism was an open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, chauvinistic, and imperialist forces of finance capital. Now, that this rhymes with the Judeo-Bolshevik theories about capitalism and communism being opposed by banks of Jews is kind of irrelevant. Dimitrov wasn't pulling from that. He was pulling from Hilferding. This meant that not all capitalists were fascists. Only the top tier of big bankers and monopolists were. This allowed the Comintern to pivot again to create a proper front, which aligned with progressive members of the middle class and liberal capitalists to fight the specific threat of finance-backed fascism. In many ways, Dimitrov was actually the economic theorist of the Popular Front, which had developed in France on the ground from actual events. This also led to another problem. Convergent to this, Eugene Varga, the Comintern's top economist, kind of got himself in a lot of trouble during the period that we're talking about. Varga argued that despite the 1929 crash, finance capital had resiliency that the third period had ignored. He noted that the state was using finance capital to build state monopoly capitalism, which was consistent with Bukharin's earlier work on imperialism. And this kind of state monopoly capital could delay a final collapse for a long, long time. Varga was criticized at the time for being a right-wing deviationist because his data just showed that capitalism wasn't collapsing fast enough. Now, this led eventually to some other theories and different later theories of monopoly capital, like the one developed by Varga, and on the dependency theory. But we're not going to talk about that today. We'll come back to that. So this is a brief historical overview of the effect of the concept of finance capital, both in our life today and in the early history of the Comintern, the Third International. But let's actually look at what Hilferding argued and how it affected Lenin, Bukharin, etc. One, the key concept was finance capital, as I already mentioned, that banking capital and industrial capital were effectively merging. Banks no longer just provided loans, they were literally owners and directors of industry through purchasing shares and through credit. This led to more monopolies and cartels being organized and leading to cartels and trust actually planning capital development. The cartelization reduced the anarchy of the market, but concentrated immense power in the hands of a few financial oligarchs. And again, he was drawing on the works of Marx and Engels to come to this conclusion. He also thought that the state would become increasingly cartelized. Hilferding argued that finance capital required a strong state to enforce the monopoly hold, and I actually think he was right about that. This led to protectionism, which cartels needed high tariffs to protect their domestic markets while they dump products abroad, and expansion. Because these markets would eventually become saturated, finance capital pushed the state towards explicit imperialism and even colonialism, forcing the opening of foreign markets and the export of capital rather than just the export of goods. So not just bringing with you what you want to trade, but also the debt instruments to trade in it. He theorized then that this would lead to a logical endpoint, the general cartel or the cartel state. He imagined a scenario where a single national bank or a small group of financiers more or less controlled the entire economy. Interesting, and actually interesting if you think about Engels talking about the joint stock market leading to one of the developments of the socialization of labor, making socialism possible. That was an Engels argument. Hilferding uses this argument by Engels to say that the highest level of organization was a stepping stone to socialism. He believed that once the economy was fully centralized under finance capital, proletariat would just need to seize the top, the commanding heights of the bank and the state to take control of the entire economic apparatus. And this could be done either through reform or revolution. The messy work of socializing production would have already been done by the capitalists themselves. Now, Lenin thought this last part was nonsense. But Lenin uses the raw economic data from Hilferding throughout imperialism. All right. Lenin also accepted the definition of finance capital as a merger of bank capital and industrial capital. What Lenin rejected was this idea that the cartel state would automatically lead to socialism, because he argued that this actually would be inherently violent and catastrophic because the pressures on the global market, and that this would also lead to parasitism, where a ruling class was parasitic on decaying capital. Nikolai Bukharin, a little bit before Lenin and influential on Lenin's work, and we're going to do a whole video on Bukharin's view of imperialism. But Bukharin's book, Imperialism, the World Economy, was written just before Lenin's pamphlet, relied heavily on Hilferding, but also pushed logic into the international area, which Lenin even pushed further. Bukharin had thought that the national trust was going to develop and that nations were becoming state capitalist trusts, meaning that there was a merger of finance, banking, and the committee of the bourgeoisie running the state. So while Hilferding focused on the internal mechanics of the bank-industry relationship, Bukharin saw this in completely national terms and basically thought that the general cartel was also going to be the state itself. Now, Karl Kautsky, as I mentioned earlier, came up with this idea of superimperialism or ultra-imperialism, depending on how you translate it. And he took the idea of the general cartel to some controversial extremes. One, he argued that the financiers could organize a national economy. They might eventually realize that the war is bad for business and organize a single global cartel as well, sort of like the IMF. And two, that this would lead to a peaceful joint exploitation of the world by united international finance. Now, there's also a more conservative critique that I mentioned early on. Werner Sombart rejected most Marxists, including Hilferding, as being too focused on abstract economic structures, and that The shift to finance was driven by a change in the capitalist spirit, a move from the creative entrepreneur to the calculating trader, which he saw as a manifestation of the Jews, and that's why Hilferding moved from a Marxist to a German historical thinker to an outright Nazi by his death. Now, we don't know that Sombart actually engaged that much with Hilferding, but Hilferding engaged a lot with him. In fact, Hilferding reviewed his book on late capitalism. Now, Hilferding's general cartel is a specific point where all these thinkers diverge. For one, Kautsky thinks the general cartel will lead to a unified global ruling class, which would lead to a similar theory to Hilferding, but now on a global level. And I'm going to just say that I actually don't think, in light of the post-World War II consensus, that we don't see some evidence that elements of Kautsky were right, but not entirely. Two, on the left, on Lenin and Bukharin, the general cartel is seen as impossible because of because of uneven development around the world, and it would lead to war because people would become competing for either colonial holdings or imperial influence. Now, it's interesting to note what Lenin thought about Hilferding. Lenin used Hilferding a lot. But in the Marginaria, we can see in volume 9 of Lenin's collected works that he was impressed by Hilferding's data, but was infuriated by his spineless political conclusions. There are specific references here. In the margins on Hilferding's chapter on the general cartel, Lenin scribbled, "This is the limit of a purely economic view. Hilferding's error is the error of the petty bourgeois reformist who believes that the state can control the banks without revolution." In fact, Lenin would even call Hilferding a Philistine for suggesting that the socialization of the economy was happening automatically under the bankers. To Lenin, this was not preparing for socialism. This was rotting capitalism as a parasitic development on top of it. And in that way, Lenin actually somewhat agrees with Werner Sombart. Lenin felt Hilferding's famous definition that the merger of the bank's industrial capital was too academic and lacked the blood and guts reality. In his notebooks, Lenin underlined Hilferding's definition and writes, "Incorrect and incomplete. It misses the most important thing, monopoly," which Bukharin was already developing. And then the state as tool, not a partner. Hilferding suggested the proletariat seize the 6 largest Berlin banks, they would effectively control the economy. Lenin thought this was very naive, and I'll just quote from the notebook. Hilferding wants to peacefully take over the banks. He forgets that's the standing army and the police cannot take over finance capital while smashing the state machinery. Now, Hilferding does say that you should seize the commanding heights. We see this in the large banks. So if we think about this, we can see that there's a big difference between Lenin and Hilferding. One, Hilferding thinks socialism is a matter of accounting and administration, or at least Lenin thinks Hilferding thinks that, and that machine runs on top of it and runs over people. Lenin calls this a bureaucratic fantasy and argued that you cannot simply inherit the capitalist machine. You have to smash it because the machine was specifically built for exploitation, not service. Yes, you can use parts of it in what you rebuild. In fact, you have to, but you can't leave it intact. Lenin also thought that the parliamentary passage that this led to would lead to just pure opportunism and not even anything under the United Front. Quote, "The possession of the state is the only means of realizing control. The struggle for socialization of the economy is a struggle for the conquest of political power." Lenin underlined similar passages and wrote opportunism in the margin. Lenin's view is that the banks and the state were so intertwined that the state would never allow them to would never be allowed to be used against the banks via the vote. And frankly, Lenin's got a lot of backup to talk about that. It kind of is true. Hilferding argued that the organized capitalism could potentially mitigate the depressions for a long time. Lenin and imperialism thought that this was organized in one country, but the international chaos would increase. So while the organization in a state monopoly capital will look good in the country itself, the international competition would be higher. Now, I think this has some things to say about modern monetary theory if they don't apply imperialism theory to it, but that's just me. So one of the funny things about this is the historical irony is between 1923 and in 1928, Hilferding served as a finance minister of the Weimar Republic. He found that taking over the banks was actually a lot damn harder than he thought. And that looking to implement capitalism as a socialist hurt the party. Lenin's critique that the capitalist state cannot be used but must be destroyed became the defining wedge between the Social Democrats and the communists. It really was one of the biggest drivers of distinction between them. The others are in State and Revolution, if you read that. Now, we have to ask ourselves, why is this so important for imperialism? And how did Hilferding come up with it through Marx and Engels? So we've talked about the imperialism part, and we'll come back to it again at the end. But Hilferding didn't just use Marx and Engels. He viewed himself as writing a fourth volume of Capital. He basically saw Marx's work as a blueprint that was correct in principle, but needed to be updated for a world full of electricity, stock markets, and global empires. So, and he extended the concentration of capital. In Capital Volume 1, Marx actually describes a law, according to him, of the concentration and centralization of capital, which means that the expropriation of many capitalists by a few capitalists. Hilferding thought that this was a completed fact by his time, and that while Marx only focused on the factory owners, Hilferding uses Marx's notes on the credit system from Capital Volume 3 to show that the bank was ultimately the tool of centralization, not just the factory. This has implications for today. Maybe we can talk about it someday. 2, Marx died before finishing Capital Volume 3, leaving behind a fragmented notes on the credit system and fictitious capital. Hilferding transformed these fragments into a coherent theory. He used Marx's definition of fictitious capital, money invested in stocks and bonds rather than physical machinery, to explain how banks control industry through controlling access to that physical machinery. He talked about the founder's profit, Hilferding's most famous original Marxian edition. He uses Marx's theory of labor, theory of value, to show how banks make massive profits simply by launching a company on the stock market, essentially skimming value before the worker even enters the factory. And thus skimming it off of futures. Engels and Socialism, Utopian and Scientific worked a lot about the anarchy of production, but Engels also had picked up that they were developing towards controlling the anarchy through the joint stock market, or what we call the joint stock holdings. Hilferding actually picks up on this and says that finance capital was actually solving the anarchy within capitalism. And he actually goes to say that this was how Engels saying that the joint stock market was going to lead to the socialization of labor. That capitalists weren't unintentionally practicing socialism through planning, but for private profits. And of course, this leads to the general cartel theory. Lastly, Marx and Engels famously called the state the executive committee of the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. Now, I agree with Ryan Allen, that Marx actually has two theories of the state that we can find in his work. That this theory of the state, in his description of the revolutions in France, are a little bit more advanced. and actually talk about the contention between capitalists themselves versus when he's describing England, which has the executive committee managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. But nonetheless, Hilferding thought that this was going to be updated for an era of protectionism under industry. That he argued the state was no longer just a committee, but had become an active economic weapon against other states. And he also thought that expansionism would lead to this, and that finance capital forces would force the state to imperialism to find new places to dump capital, not just goods. Goods are part of capital that could no longer be profitably invested at home. Now, one of the issues is that there's the orthodoxy problem here. By using Marx so strictly, Hilferding created a trap for himself that later critics like Rosa Luxemburg pointed out. He assumed that because the economy was becoming organized, the transition to socialism was simply an administrative handover. Both Luxemburg and Lenin hated this. I haven't mentioned Luxemburg in this video so far, so we'll talk about this. Luxemburg argued that Hilferding relied way too much on the mechanism of Marx's equation and ignored any revolutionary agency of the workers at all. A critique that Lenin would actually very much expand on. And this is a problem that we've been seeing in analytic Marxists today, where you just bracket out the relations of production and make it seem like capital just works on its own because it's possibly structuralized. Also, Hilferding's theory of the founder's profit is a mathematical bridge he tried to build to connect Marxist theory of value to modern stock markets. He wanted to explain how modern banks can make millions in a single day without actually producing a single physical commodity. But this is easily explained by rents, which is essentially what the founder's profit is. All right. Hilferding also used Marx's concept of the price of production and combined it with the phenomenon of capitalization. So he thought that there was an industrial reality. Imagine an industrial enterprise with a total capital of $1,000. And according to Marx, his capital would lead an average way a profit of about 10% a year. But then there's a financial transformation. Banks would take the company and turn it into a joint stock company. And the banks doesn't sell the shares based on the amount spent. Instead, it shows the value based on an interest rate. If the current market interest is only 5%, an income of $100,000 is seen by the market as a yield on capital of $2 million. I think I got the numbers wrong on that. So if you have a couple if you have a 10% of $1 million, you're going to have $100,000 a year. And if you have an interest rate of 5% and you have that $100,000 income, the yield on capital is $2 million. So Hilferding expressed this creation of fictitious capital through an actual equation, which I'll spare you. But the bank pockets the $1 million difference, being the middleman that converted the industrial capital into a financial asset. Why this matters so much in Marx's theory is, one, it explains bank supremacy over capital, even in the early 20th century. Two, it explains why fictitious capital can actually seemingly generate a profit. Whether or not it's an actual profit is hard to deal with. And it is hinted at in volumes 3, but it's not fully dealt with. And three, there's a concentration of power that this creates, leading to more and more power that banks have over the market. Critical differences. Marx saw capitalist profit making through the MCM circuit, or the MCM prime, which is money, commodity, more money cycle. Hilferding saw the financials making profits through capitalization, which is selling the rights to future profits as if it was a commodity itself. Two, Marx argued in Capital Volume 3 that capitalists automate the organic composition of capital rises, meaning there's more fixed capital or more machines. Since human labor produces surplus value because it's variable capital, the rate of profit tends to fall, eventually leading to a production stop. But Hilferding basically thought that this would be fixed by financial capital and cartelization. Cartels delay the fall. They don't stop it, but they managed the falling rate of profits to keep profits high through financialization and by constantly pushing the can down the road. 2, cartels plan their production not on the whole economy, but on the organized sectors, large corporations and finance capital, and then the unorganized sections, which are low profits, such as small consumer goods and agriculture. Because of the founder's profit for Hilferding, there's a massive amount of fictitious capital and stocks floating around. The moment the unorganized sector fails, it triggers a chain reaction. Banks, which are tied to everyone, suddenly find their fictitious assets are worthless because they cannot valorize them at their valuation. Now, we can think about this. We deal with Lenin's talking about imperialism as a starve-off. The falling rate of profits is exactly why Lenin had issues with Hilferding. In fact, one of the things about Lenin's imperialism is it actually solves 2 economic problems. I'm going to talk about this more on the book. We talk about the pamphlet that Lenin wrote, and I mentioned it a lot twice, and it's really important here, but we'll come back to that. So imperialism is a stave off because there is a falling rate of profits at home. You have the global market to make up the profits. You also have other ways to leverage uneven development. Lenin then thought that Hilferding's organized capitalism was a decaying capitalism, decadent capitalism. He didn't believe that the general cartels would ever be stable because they would need to expand their markets in competition with each other, which would lead to geopolitical chaos. So if we think about this today, Hilferding seems both discredited and not discredited simultaneously. Economists today will actually probably find Hilferding more relevant than Marx, at least regarding 2008. The falling rate of profit isn't what caused 2008. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, or I'm going to talk about the controversies around that, but it was a credit snap where fictitious capital broke and then the profit rates couldn't sustain it. The crisis was a disproportionality between the housing and finance market and the actual ability to pay their debts through, production. Now, this gets into some differences between other forms of heterodox economics and Marxism, even Hilferding's form. Hilferding does actually pretty accurately predict what was going to happen to the banking industry, where the paper economy loses touch with the real economy and thus leads to massive devaluation. And if you want to understand Hilferding as like a key bridge figure between where modern social democracy starts picking up Keynesianism, because Keynesians really do believe the economy is organized and you can manage it by managing the banks. This was also a belief of parts of the German historical school. See Knapp, the predecessor to modern monetary theory. Marxists believe that crisis is structural and inevitable, and we do have a business cycle that backs that up, that there are financial crises, but the final crisis always seems to be a little bit further in the distance. Luxemburg and Lenin attacked the automatic socialism fallacy that Hilferding had, as an extension of like almost the Bernsteinian line. That socialism was just a simple administrative handover, and there are many socialists today, some of them write for Jacobin magazine, who believe that, and yet that's not happened in 110 years since this time. In The Accumulation of Capital, which is a text that I have some problems with, but I think it's important and I do need to discuss it, Luxemburg found the idea that cartelization could stop the anarchy of profits fundamentally un-Marxist. She, in some ways, predates Lenin in this view that capitalism must expand into non-capitalist areas and that this was going to be a form of tension between capitalist states. And also, eventually, you run out of non-capitalist areas. Lastly, um, Luxemburg saw Hilferding's theories as scientific justification for pure reformism, just like Lenin saw his work as opportunism. If capitalism becomes more organized and stable, then the revolution is no longer an urgent necessity. And this is also their critique of Bernstein. One can simply wait for the general cartel to finish its work and win gradual reforms through parliament and then seize control through parliament. But she argued that reforms were not a substitute for the seizure of power, but it means they're preparing workers for the seizure of power. She's actually being a relatively orthodox Marxist in this term. And she warned that the party that followed Hilferding logic would cease to be a revolutionary party and become a socialist repair shop for capitalism. That's helping capitalism actually be more sustainable. If we want to look at Luxemburg's warnings, they're kind of prophetic from the 1819 German Revolution. Hilferding and the SPD leadership stuck to their organized and parliamentary view, so they maintained order and stabilized the state. Luxemburg, leading the Spartacists, called for total dismantling of the old machinery. This led to a conflict between the Ebert-led faction of the SPD government, suppressing the Spartacist uprising, where they actually used right-wing paramilitary groups to do it, during which Luxemburg was murdered. In the early years of the Soviet Union, the tension between Hilferding's organized view and Luxemburg's collapse revolution view became literally the basis of the 1920s and 30s debates that I talked about in the commentary. Now, you could see a lot of other things I could go into other areas of the Soviet Union where this is important. In early Soviet planning, especially under Bukharin's new economic policy, well, since Bukharin's was also Lenin's, was deeply influenced by the general cartel theory, except that the general cartel was going to be controlled by state capitalists within the Soviet Union. So the worker state was going to control the state capitalist development. The logic was that capitalism, in order to become a single organized union, the Soviet state simply had to become a general cartel within itself. And this is kind of the basis for Gosplan, which was the state planning committee, which was originally conceived of literally as one big bank. Basically, instead of the Fed, you had the Fed was everything. Lenin famously said that socialism is nothing but a state capitalist monopoly, which has been turned to the interest of the whole people. One of Lenin's many definitions of socialism, which can get a little bit problematic. The problem is, though, there's a problem of the peasantry. So Eugenie Pravotinsky, actually kind of picking up on Luxemburg's logic, argued that capitalism survives by exploiting non-capitalist environments. Pravotinsky argued that the new socialist industry was like a socialist island in a peasant sea, which would act capitalistically in some ways. So the socialist cartel had to exploit the peasants by keeping agricultural prices low and industry prices high, essentially treating the peasantry like an internal colony and leading to a backlash. This led to the development between Pravotinsky and Bukharin was initially, as I've said in many other videos, associated with the left wing of the Bolsheviks. This is a period where he gets associated with the right. Now, in the 1930s, Hilferding was just banned in the Soviet Union, which is a little bit weird given how important he was to Lenin. Even though they were building exactly what he described, a single bank control economy, his insistence on the transition could be democratic and parliamentary was considered counter-revolutionary. So, one core critique that you see from Grossman is fascinating. And Grossman argued that organized capitalism was a myth. And he basically implied that Hilferding and others like him have abandoned labor theory of value in favor of a psychological view of the market. Uh, Grossman said that no amount of organization could save capitalism from the crisis because it wasn't caused by the anarchy of the market, but it was caused by the overaccumulation of capital itself, and that the lack of surplus value to keep the system profitable because of overcompilation. This led to some of the greatest debates in socialist history because it comes up of both Marxists and non-Marxists, which is underconsumption versus overaccumulation. And at first, these don't seem like different views. Heinrich Grossman encouraged people like Hilferding of being a neo-harmonist, thinking that capitalism can reach a state of balance. Hilferding focused on disproportionality, argued that crisis happened because different branches of industry didn't grow at the same rate. But Grossman used Otto Bauer's reproduction schemas and the mathematical models of capital growth to prove that even if the economy was perfectly proportional and perfectly organized, it would still collapse due to the falling rate of profit. Furthermore, Grossman explicitly critiqued the founder's profit as a distraction. He argued that profit doesn't come out of thin air. It is simply redistribution of surplus value already produced by workers. By focusing on the distribution of profits between bank and industry and claims on futures of profits in terms of money, Grossman felt that Hilferding was ignoring that production of profit is still in the factory or in general commodity somewhere. Hilferding has even famously said, Grossman even famously said about Hilferding that Hilferding's general cartel is a purely cerebral construct. It ignores the fact that even a single ward trust would be subject to the law of the falling rate of profit. And in fact, Heinrich Grossman even thought that monopolies would accelerate the problem by concentration of capital and lead to breakdown, which is interesting. If you think about why this would be relevant today, this debate between Grossman and Hilferding, it could lead to a couple of different things. One, regulating your bank's not going to work, and two, this is going to inherently spread out into the larger economy, leading to Lenin's imperialism and other problems there. Now, I'm going to come back to finance capitalism because Michael Hudson talks about this a great deal. And we're going to end here because this video has now been going for an hour. I covered a lot of material. I'm going to put a reading list in the show notes, and I will create a self-study guide for you to go into this on your own time. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. There's more behind the Patreon. You can also go to Patreon and find the self-study list for free. I've already done 2 now on the Popular Front and the United Front. And I'm going to continue every other week devoting to lessons on history and the meanings of terms, debates like this. I know these are kind of meandering. What I'm doing is literally condensing sometimes up to 50, 60 pages of notes and trying to turn them into a rough outline to turn into these videos. And I hope they help you when you combine them with other things. Think of this not as Marxism 101, but as a transition from Marxism 101 to Marxism 2000. Meaning that we are going from freshman level Marxists that mostly show stop to something that can get you inundated in the history. I have tried to do this in other shows. I famously tried to do this with Pop the Left, but it was too basic. And you might say, well, these long, hour-long meandering things that you're doing that cover all elements of a term are also pretty hard to deal with, but I'm going to try to provide supports for this educational project. Forum Blog is an educational project. It is technically a for-profit educational project, ironically, since I'm a Marxist, but nonetheless, I do try to provide most of this to you for free. Take care, protect your peace, and dream of a better tomorrow.